This is The Green Line, a 5-part miniseries focusing on the near-term geopolitical implications of climate change. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. When it comes to carbon emissions, 78% of all of those emissions come from burning fossil fuels, mostly either through electricity production or transportation. It is by far the largest source of our CO2 problem. So therefore, it should be the very first thing we look to fix, right? But doing that might be like trying to replace parts of your ladder whilst also standing on it. Let's take the US as an example. If the United States were to stop producing fossil fuels tomorrow, that would be 7.8% of their GDP disappearing overnight. To put that in context, the GDP reduction at the peak of the Great Recession of 2008, the US GDP only shrank by 4.3%, and eliminating fossil fuels would be eliminating 7.8%. And the US position isn't even that bad comparatively. You see, what happens when we look at a country like Angola or Kuwait, who have over 80% of their economy tied into fossil fuels? What happens to their society in a post-oil world, where they lose 80% of their economy overnight? Devastating wouldn't even cover it. But I can already hear you saying, look, there is plenty of oil to go around, we're not going to run out any time, particularly countries like Kuwait. And I would be the absolute first to agree with you. The supply is there, but it's the demand for oil that's shrinking. As with every driver that switches to an EV, every country that implements a green energy policy, every city to adopt LPG as its main energy source, the demand for oil shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. Now, I'm in the firm belief that we'll never completely get off oil, and there will always be some industries that make these energy shifts much later than most of us. Industries like high-end refining, long-haul trucking, or even certain jet engines will have a far more difficult time of implementing an energy transition. But large parts of our infrastructure, like energy production or public transport or most people's cars, they can make that transition, and they eventually will. So with that in mind, I want you to take 3 seconds now and think about which country is most likely to be the biggest benefactor of the demand for oil continuously shrinking. Take 3 seconds. Now, I would place a decent bet that you weren't imagining Saudi Arabia. But as it turns out, Saudi Arabia might be the last man standing. You see, the interesting factor, and the often overlooked factor in this problem, is about the break-even price of oil. You see, even though the petrol you put in your car is roughly the same from station to station, the oil to make it will be completely different from country to country. Some of them more pure than others, some more expensive to refine than others. And with the variations in oil and the difficulties some countries will go through to get it out of the ground, the price to produce each barrel of oil will also be completely different from country to country. To produce a barrel of oil in the UK might cost $45, as they have to get it out of the North Sea offshore. But for Kuwait, who can just dig it straight out of the ground, it might cost just $12. Which in the situation we are today, with oil being sold at around $80 a barrel, everything's fine. Everybody's making money. But what happens when the demand slows down and the price starts to drop? From 80 to 70 to 60 to 50, and then to 40. And at $40, the UK is now losing money on every single barrel of oil it produces, and because of which they're forced to leave the market. The UK can no longer produce oil. At $30, we say goodbye to Brazil's oil market. At $25, we lose Nigeria, Venezuela, and Canada. At $20, we lose the entire US shale and fracking industry, as well as Norway. At $15, we lose the rest of the US, most of Russia, Iran, and Iraq. And at $10 a barrel, all that remains are parts of Russia, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. The last man standing. Imagine how different the geopolitical chessboard looks at each of these stages. At $45, we watch the UK energy crisis get much worse, as the UK can no longer afford to produce oil. Followed by the next drop, we watch the powerhouse of South America lose its economic backbone. To the next drop, where the US is being forced to make a tough choice between either gouging its national budget to prop up oil producers and keep the domestic oil fields in production, or become completely reliant on countries like Saudi Arabia or Russia to supply the oil the US needs. Yes, the pond that is the demand for oil is shrinking, but the pond will also be completely owned by countries like Saudi Arabia, who have the cheapest cost of production. This is a tough decision that the US will likely have to make now, to either prepare for this upcoming shift in the market, or ready themselves to cling to their domestic industry far beyond its economic viability, much like they're doing now with coal. After all, it wasn't the government regulations that killed the coal industry, it was the fact that the demand for coal shrank, with other sources becoming cheaper and more efficient. and the more expensive parts of the industry close down. Energy transition will be the biggest upturning of the geopolitical chessboard in our lifetime, and yet so few countries are actually preparing for it. A situation that for some of these countries will mean 80% of their economies disappearing in a very short space of time, as by no fault of their own, the market prices them out of viability. So how will all of this play out? Who are the geopolitical winners and losers from this situation? And what timeframes are we looking at here? Well, to answer all of that, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. Cascading Chaos.
So let me start by giving you an analogy, which is based on where I live in Japan. Japan is a country that for many centuries has been subject to a significant but infrequent external risk, which is the risk of earthquakes. And a whole lot of things, when you move here, a whole lot of things in this society are designed to accommodate that fact, from the physical infrastructure to the financial system to the way people are taught in school. And as a result, Japan, when it suffers even really terrible disasters like what happened in Fukushima in 2011, the results are a lot less severe than they would be in almost any other country in the world. And it speaks to the concept of when you're in an area that has this outlier risk and you don't know exactly when the risk is coming, but you know eventually it's going to happen, great levels of preparedness produce great results. We are concerned that a number of oil-producing countries are going to be the opposite of that. In other words, they've also got an earthquake coming. That earthquake is going to be the combination of an enforced transition to electric vehicles in a number of major petroleum-consuming markets, along with those regulations being a lot more severe over the 2020s, because we're going to start to have much more extreme forms of climate change that are going to put pressure on these countries to speed up those transitions.
Lou Munden leads the Mission Climate Project, a think tank focused on the social, political, and economic impacts of climate change in the 2020s. The project produces a risk analysis on a wide range of subjects, ranging from water to energy transition to food security and many more. And we're thrilled to have him back on the program today.
If you look at what that looks like, it is an earthquake. And to break that down just a little bit, there's a Norwegian company called Equinor, oil and gas company, that projects that you're going to see a 47% decline in demand for petroleum by 2050. But the part of that is interesting is the beginning of that in the 2020s. When you first start to see this demand decline, it's going to start to pick off some countries. There's going to be a separation, essentially, between countries that have low costs of production and low CO2 emissions, and countries that have high costs of production and high CO2 emissions. Those higher cost, higher emission countries are going to be the ones that most immediately suffer from that sort of effect. So that earthquake is going to shake them first, and in a number of different ways, we're concerned that they're not ready for it.
So with these earthquake-like events you're talking about here, are they likely to impact the developed or the developing world first? Or will it affect everyone at the same time?
So it's going to be primarily felt first in the developing world. And the reason for that is that there's a disproportionate number of these high cost, high emissions oil producers in those kinds of countries. But I think maybe the more important question to think about here is, why does this really matter? It's all fine and great as a potential transition in the oil market, but why does that matter from a security standpoint? And the reason that it matters from a security standpoint is that in a number of these countries, some of them not just developing, but also developed, this influx of capital that comes from oil and also associated from natural gas production is absolutely vital for maintenance of elite political consensus. In various forms, some of them legal, some of them not so legal, that cash coming in on a regular basis allows the elite to essentially receive enough benefits from the system that they're in, and therefore have an ongoing interest in that system continuing in a roughly stable fashion. Perhaps somewhat dysfunctional for the people that live there, but at the elite level, it works out. When you subtract that revenue, when you take that cash influx out, that's going to be tremendously and immediately consequential in a number of different countries, and that will inevitably spill over into security concerns. And I want to state this very clearly. We're not talking about these sorts of spillovers happening in a longer time frame, so 2040s, 2050s, things like that. We're talking about this sort of stuff starting to happen as early as this decade.
So can you point to an example of one of these security concerns?
So in some places, it's going to be relatively contained. So if you're a citizen of the country that's impacted, it's not going to work out very, very well for you. If you're a member of the elite of one of those countries, it's gonna cause you to recalibrate what your allegiances and loyalties are, but probably not going to be internationally consequential. There's a second type, which is that it would spill over more regionally, and so it would have international implications, but perhaps not beyond a certain region of the world. So I'll break down an example of each one of those to give you a sense of what it is that we're talking about. Let's talk about first a sort of more contained example. It's an easy one for people to understand. If you look at Venezuela, it's a great example of the fact that not all oil is exactly the same. So what we pull out of the ground, produce oil, which eventually produces petroleum, is not the same all around the world. Venezuela has particularly heavy oil, and its costs to extract and refine at a very basic level are quite a lot higher. So estimated in 2019 it being roughly 3 times the cost that you see in Saudi Arabia. In addition to that, because of the inefficiency of Venezuela's processing infrastructure, in part because it hasn't been invested in for some time for obvious reasons, in part also just because of the underlying nature of the oil that they have to process, the emissions associated with the process of refining the oil are also significantly higher. So those are roughly 5 times as high as you see in Saudi Arabia. For these reasons, as you start to see demand decline for oil because of this EV transition, because of this near-term climate change effect, you're going to start to see producers like that hit first, and they're going to be hit with a bit of a double whammy. One is going to be just an overall decline in the price of oil, but the second is that inevitably there's going to be some accounting in global trade relationships for carbon intensity of production. And the very high carbon producers of these sorts of things are going to be hit first, whether through some sort of taxation scheme or through some sort of trade penalty, something along those lines. They're going to be the ones that go first, because people are going to start to care about emissions, improbable as this may seem now, because they're worried about the impacts that it has on weather, because those weather impacts are going to start to become more severe. All of that being said, Venezuela, and there's other countries that have sort of similar problems, so like Equatorial Guinea, places like that, it's pretty unlikely that that's going to leak out into the broader South American landscape. In Venezuela's case, largely because the current context is things have gone just about as badly as you can imagine over the last decade, and so there's limited room for increased impact. There are other countries, however, where you have some similar issues where there is a likely regional spillover. So to give an example of that, let's talk about Nigeria. In Nigeria, you do have the phenomenon of significantly higher emissions from production. You also have significantly higher costs, roughly in line with Venezuela's. But you have sort of an additional factor which is really remarkable and troublesome for Nigeria, which is that corruption is so overpowering in the oil sector in Nigeria that it suggests that the country essentially stays functioning at a kind of elite level because of these massive revenues that come in from oil and then are diverted into people's pockets. So to give an example of that, we've seen pretty extraordinarily high oil prices this year. Reuters, that did an examination of this back in September, found that Nigeria had an average of $94 a barrel, which is pretty high, 42% higher than the previous year. And yet zero, and I mean literally $0 went into state coffers from the national oil company. How can that be? Why is that? One thing is that Nigeria's production is just subject to a tremendous amount of localized corruption that when you add it up all together ends up with a lot of their production being stolen. This is just stuff like people literally tapping into pipelines and siphoning oil off. To give you some sense of how large that is, you're talking about 200,000 barrels a day out of a country that produces about 1 million barrels a day total. So it's a really, really large number that gets taken off the top. In addition to that, there's all sorts of backroom deals, contracts that get written in a certain way, preferential revenue payments, all that sort of stuff, which add up to very, very significant amounts of money that don't end up in public coffers as they should to support Nigeria's citizens, but instead end up in elite pockets too. So it's a fairly remarkable amount of cash. So again, to get back to the point of why this matters, when you have a situation like that, rightly or wrongly, that is essential to the elite political consensus of a country. When you have assumed revenues that are coming in, particularly that are coming in hard currency, that allows you to maintain a certain admittedly dysfunctional and not great for citizens, but nevertheless stability. And now that this transition is going to start to get underway, now that you're going to start to see the beginning of this 47% decline in demand, it's going to be countries like that end up getting picked off. Nigeria's role in the broader economy of West Africa is absolutely crucial. It is the most important economy in that region by a very, very significant margin. And once that starts to go by the boards a bit, that's going to create really serious potential spillover effects. Some of that will happen in regions that have strong cultural links to the northern part of Nigeria. So that'll be places that are already a little bit restive anyway, Burkina Faso, Niger, places like that. But it may also introduce sources of new instability into a coastal Western Africa. And so that's going to be places like Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, things along those lines. All of that to say that you have the potential not just for Nigeria to start to sort of fracture because of the extraction of this money, but also for that to spill over into a number of different neighboring countries, creating a kind of regional crisis that, although the beginning of that regional crisis happened for a very good reason, which is that we're trying to decarbonize, ends up being tremendously consequential from a security perspective.
So with so few oil sources actually staying in business, a country's going to have to start making that really tough decision, choosing between either cheap energy that doesn't drive up the cost of everything within society, or secure energy that doesn't come with the risk of your entire country's oil supply disappearing overnight. Is that choice on its way?
So if you're talking about the consumer countries, any country that's faced with a choice between cheap sources of energy and expensive but important for security sources of energy are going to choose the cheap sources of energy. And here's why. You have to remember that as we're talking about these near-term climate effects in the 2020s, that these are also going to be experienced, and the associated instability is going to be experienced in consumer countries as well. It's not just going to be limited to sort of the poorer parts of the developing world. You're also going to see a number of countries increased instability in their food production, increased instability in their electricity production, and all of that is going to make it very, very difficult for any of those countries politically to maintain anything other than a policy of keeping the best possible access to the cheapest forms of energy.
When we think of the energy transition, the majority of us probably picture cars switching over to EVs, which is a part of it. But the major piece of the puzzle when it comes to the energy transition is in electricity production. It's not even in the back of most people's minds, but our power grids are, for the majority of countries, where the lion's share of our fossil fuels end up. So are we able to reform our world here by upgrading our power grids to use solar and renewable energies? That is the major aim of most countries, to fix the problem here at the power production stage. But the process of doing so is far more complicated and difficult than many would imagine. And to take us through the uphill battle we have ahead of us, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. Develop or demise.
Well, the first thing I would say is we have to think not only about countries, but about sectors. The big winner in the energy sector is going to be electricity. In fact, when the International Energy Agency tries to think about what infrastructure would make it possible to achieve our climate change goals, they argue that the world is going to have to move to 50% of the energy that we use will be in the form of electricity. Currently, depending on the country, that's between 17, 19% for a developed country. So what we're talking about is this massive shift to electricity. And even though a good portion of that will be renewable energy, it is in the nature of grids that they're much more stable if you can connect grids that are supplied by different sources and across more than one time zone. So unless and until we arrive at a cost-effective, small-scale electricity storage solution, one of the things that the energy transition is going to push us towards is increasingly multi-state electricity grids.
Theresa Sabonis-Helf is the inaugural chair of the Science, Technology and International Affairs concentration in the master's degree program at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Prior to joining Georgetown, she was also a professor of national security at the National War College in Washington. She's also lived and worked in several countries of the former USSR and assisted two of those nations with the development of their first national security strategies. She's been published and lectured extensively on climate change policies, energy security, and the politics of electricity, and is a frequent advisor to the US Department of State and USAID, as well as a member of the Council of Foreign Affairs. And we're thrilled to have her on the program today.
The example of the one that is so far the most successful and is also expanding rapidly is ENTSO-E, and that's the European electricity grid. Even Turkey is connected to an extent to that grid. It incorporates not only Europe, but a good chunk of states that are candidates for joining the European Union. That grid enables. The reason why time zones matter is because peak demand for electricity is extremely time sensitive. So at about 6 o'clock, 6:30 in the evening, shops are still open, people are home cooking, charging their devices, getting their news. And so at 6:30 in the evening, grids are under strain. Meanwhile, at 2 o'clock in the morning, when everyone's asleep and no one's really using electricity, there's often surplus electricity in the grid. And electricity has to keep moving. So unless we can store it effectively, which we still cannot do on a large scale, we have to be able to move the electricity. In other words, when you can move it across time zones, you smooth out a little bit the fact that contemporary urban societies tend to have demand fluctuations of 150% every 24 hours.
When it comes to countries like France, Germany, or Australia, we're all making meaningful strides toward decarbonisation, with more and more of the electricity being created in our countries coming from renewable sources, which is good news, with the average citizen having to change their habits very little. In fact, some people may not even be aware that the power they're using to turn on their microwave came from power sources like wind or solar. But what about the developing nations? Nations like Nigeria or Lebanon, nations whose power grids aren't broken down and in many cases rely on fuel-guzzling portable diesel engines to power their homes and shops. How can we get those guys to decarbonise? Is there any sort of leapfrog technology that would take these nations from where we were in the 1930s and bring them all the way up to where we are now?
The answer is very different for developing countries with fossil fuel endowments and developing countries without. The thing about renewable energy is that it's high upfront cost, but then the maintenance cost is very low. And so China and other developing states that are not resource rich are finding that if they can get the initial investment, then it makes enormous amounts of sense to go renewable. But if you take a country that already has fossil fuels on its territory, it's still going to be difficult to compete with something like coal in a coal-rich country. But bear in mind that China already made the decision that it will no longer fund development of new coal outside of its own borders. So getting the resources to develop coal, even though coal is cheaper to stand up than renewable forms of energy, is going to get harder. So I think what we'll see is in some places in the developing world, there will be a continuing rush to fossil fuels. Certainly what we're seeing in Turkey and in Pakistan reflects that. But in some parts of the world, that leap forward will happen. And the UN does have a very explicit plan to try to get the lights on in Africa. We still have 10% of the world that does not have regular access to electricity. And electrifying that remaining portion of the world, those 750 million people, I believe is the number, that is a priority under the UN Sustainable Development Goals.
When you look at a country like Angola, they don't really have much else going for them apart from oil. And the government knows that every dollar they put into oil, they get 4 to 5 back at minimum. Whereas every dollar they put into textiles, for instance, they'll be lucky to make a return. So how do we convince countries like that they need to move away from oil?
So I think it's a really important and it's kind of a painful question because I'm not sure that will be an easy thing to do. When we look at countries in the world that develop fossil fuels, there's two different prices that we have to think about. What is the break-even cost? How much does it cost for that country to get its oil out of the ground per barrel? And that price is very different by country. Canada is much more expensive to get out of the ground. Saudi Arabia wins for the cheapest, easiest to get out of the ground into market. For the countries that have a low price to get it out of the ground, it's going to be a very slow move away. In fact, I would predict that for countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia, where the price to get oil and gas out of the ground is low relative to other nations, they're likely to be among the last standing.
So Angola might take a bit longer to make that leap into green tech, but we all assume the West still would. That was until the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February, which after that point a lot of countries were forced to cut ties with Russian gas and look elsewhere. Germany, though, was one of the most reliant on Russian gas, and by cutting it faced an immediate energy crisis. And in response, Germany restarted a number of its very dirty coal power stations. But there's an argument to be made that they were forced into this choice. See, Berlin believed they were 7 to 15 years away from being able to power the entire country by renewables. But gas giants like Qatar wanted Germany to sign 25-year contracts with minimum spends, meaning that Germany would have to buy huge amounts of Qatari gas every single year, even if the country had moved to complete power by renewables. How much do these long-term contracts, usually proposed by gas giants like Qatar, shape countries' transition plans?
There is some validity to it. If we look at the European-Russian relationship, in some respects, this isn't the whole story, but a piece of the story is that Europe has been very loudly signaling that they want to move away from gas at the same time that they were trying to shape Russian behavior in gas. This is prior to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. But what we see is that when you do that infrastructure investment, you don't necessarily have to commit to a 25-year, but many of these investments have long 15, 20-year paybacks. And so if you commit to that infrastructure, either you're committing to that branch for the long term, or you're going further down a path that Europe is already exploring, which is you decide that hydrogen is going to be important, maybe not because it is the most obvious candidate, but because it is the candidate that can use the existing natural gas infrastructure.
Well, speaking of the war in Ukraine, reading some of your work, you refer to this current conflict in Ukraine as the first war of energy transition. Can you take us through what you mean by that?
So if we walk back to several years ago, in 2011, Ukraine declared that it was going to join the Energy Charter, the European rules-based set of how energy is supposed to be managed. And it was the goal of Ukraine's to be able to trade electricity in particular with Europe. And Europe was very welcoming of the Ukraine because the Ukraine, frankly, has a surplus nuclear power generating capacity. So in Europe's search for low carbon next generation energy, fully utilizing what's already there was very attractive. And Ukraine was on a path to join the European electricity grid. The rules with ENTSO-E, the European grid, are that you have to get a whole series of laws and regulations in place. And then there's the final test. And the final test is actually particularly difficult for small countries. The final test is the reason why the Baltic states are still not yet in ENTSO-E, because what you have to do is to disconnect from all other countries and demonstrate that your country is capable of self-standing, of keeping the lights on entirely by itself for a week. And the tradition is you demonstrate that for a week, then you go back to your pre-existing grid while the agreements are finalized, and within a year you get into the ENTSO-E grid. Ukraine was on track to do that, and they had actually already signed an agreement with the European Union to do their standalone test. And the agreement was to do the standalone test the last week of February. And so, even as Russian tanks were rolling in, Ukraine continued with its commitment and delinked from all other grids. So it was operating in a standalone mode for the first month of the war. And although the test was only supposed to last a week, the Ukrainians recognized that trying to relink to Russia and Belarus made no sense at all. And so they appealed to the European Union to let them into ENTSO-E early. And the European grid company had some concerns and some skepticism. It took them a month to decide to let Ukraine into ENTSO-E. But Ukraine was allowed in March. And from March until August, Ukraine was exporting electricity to Europe. In fact, it was an important source of revenue for the Ukrainian government, and they were supplying, by some reports, up to 5% of European electricity. So they were being helpful to Europe in a period when energy prices were skyrocketing because of Russian behavior. This is why Russia decided that it was a strategic, or at least a tactical objective, to try to force nuclear power plants to go offline. Because Zaporizhzhia is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. And even though they were only operating little less than half of the capacity of Zaporizhzhia, the demonstration that Russia could threaten the nuclear power plants, force them to be shut down, and force Ukraine to no longer be self-sufficient in electricity, what became an important tactical objective for the Russians.
Playing a bit of devil's advocate here, but surely in the case of countries that export energy, they'd be a benefit to Europe by having them on the grid. A, it would give Europe additional power, and B, it would give Europe lots of leverage to turn off parts of that country's grid if they were going down a dark path. Again, just playing devil's advocate here, but why not expand these grids exponentially? The more the merrier. What is the risk of putting more and more countries onto the single European grid?
Well, there are ways to build a grid that insulates you against the problems of your neighbors, but the cost of building a grid that goes across many borders is a considerable initial investment. So you need to be persuaded that the neighbors have a commitment to the same set of rules, that you have a shared set of understandings about how the market is going to operate. If we look at Central America, in fact, Central America built a grid connecting across 5 countries, but because they couldn't get a consensus on the rules, and because some countries had an interest in not allowing cheaper electricity inputs from other countries, that grid was underutilized for a decade after it was built. So the European Union was trying to ensure that that did not happen. But for countries already in the ENTSO-E, it is a matter of European policy to encourage as much electricity trade as possible. And if we look at the energy projects of strategic interest on the European list, most of them are electricity. Most of them have to do with trading electricity more. So if you have consistent rules, if you can physically secure the infrastructure, and if you have similar safety standards, then there are some real benefits. But of course, being within the European Union makes rule of law more easy to understand. Think by contrast of a grid that is championed by Japan. It does not yet exist, and it might not ever exist, but the Asian supergrid would see building a lot of solar capacity in Mongolia. The electricity from Mongolia would cross and integrate in some limited ways with the Russian and the Chinese grid and the Korean grid, and then go through an undersea component to connect Japan. Now, for Japan, that diversifies risk, but there's an enormous amount of political risk in building and counting on a grid that links those countries together. So you can see that the geopolitics of electricity have to do with figuring out what potential partners have complementary assets for a grid, but also what potential partners can be reliable partners and share your own country's assumptions about how the grid should operate and what the rules must be.
The stats we have in front of us here indicate that the demand for fossil fuels will drop over time, first in the developed world and then in the developing. So what do you think will be the major drives of this? Will it be the switch to electric vehicles, or the switching to renewables for electricity production, or even new technology? What do you think will be the big drivers of the move away from fossil fuels over the next few decades?
All the way up until about 2010, we were talking about peak oil, that fear that we would want more. Peak oil was not the moment when we run out of oil. It was the moment after which we could never supply more than we had the day before. And as we approached what was perceived to be peak oil supply, and there were major technological breakthroughs in things like horizontal drilling and fracking, at that same time, the world began moving slightly away from oil. So now we think about peak oil demand. Peak oil demand does not mean that tomorrow the world will not want any oil. What it means is the assumption, which may or may not be correct, that the world will never again want more barrels of oil per day than it did at the highest point. So if we understand the highest point, which was slightly before COVID, of 100 million barrels a day, if we're past peak demand, that means we assume that the world is never going to want more than 100 million barrels of oil a day. And what causes that shift is that this may strike some of the listeners as very surprising because we always talk about beyond oil. We're still, as of 2021, in a world in which oil is the single largest component of the global energy puzzle. But natural gas has been rising at a rate where it soon will no longer be the number one input. So we're not done with oil, but we are approaching a moment where oil will be a less overwhelmingly important input to world energy overall than probably gas. Gas is what's poised to rise relative to oil.
So if countries want to keep most of their current infrastructure, but want to reduce their impact on the environment, in many cases they're going to turn toward natural gas as their power source. But this global shift from oil toward natural gas as an energy source creates a big long-term shuffle of the geopolitical chessboard. A number of the world's biggest economic exporters like Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, the UAE and Canada have lots of oil, but comparatively not as much gas. When it comes to natural gas, tiny little Qatar becomes the king of the world. Russia becomes even more important. The US and China have domestic supplies, and countries like Australia, Algeria, Turkmenistan, and Indonesia take far bigger roles on the global stage. So if a petrostate like Saudi Arabia sees this transition coming, do you think they'll try to adapt their economy now whilst the sun is shining, or will they watch as their position of current prominence begins to wane and they become overshadowed by the gas giants?
You're absolutely right. There will be instabilities associated with the sundown of oil and gas. OPEC has been arguing this for decades. In fact, they've always attended the climate conferences, and the OPEC bloc has always argued that these countries need some special attention or some assistance to deal with a world in which oil might be less important. Historically, that was the way of slowing the negotiations. I would argue that it wasn't done in good faith, but we are going to slowly arrive at a time and a place where it is the case. And when you say that the price of oil is going to drop, that may well be the case. The other possibility is that as the world bifurcates, as countries that can afford to and countries that choose to go increasingly renewable, it is quite possible that a large number of countries will continue to use the fossil fuel resources that are available because the price will drop. You made the argument early on that it's difficult to make the argument to a country like Angola that they should do something other than develop their oil. Well, it's certainly difficult to make the argument to a country like India that they should use less oil as oil becomes less expensive. So we are going to face some kind of discontinuous markets and some kind of significant instabilities.
So you mentioned a few times today, and I'm sure there are already people thinking about it, but what about nuclear power? Yes, I've read the stats and I know that for the most part it is incredibly safe, but I've also read the papers about what happens when things go wrong, and even spent time at Chernobyl myself. Because the underlying worry about nuclear power is that when things go wrong, they go really wrong. So we'll put that aside for a moment. We'll also put aside the fact that to build enough nuclear power plants to take over from oil and gas, it would take around 50 years to do so, to which point we're likely to have moved to renewables by that point anyway. We'll also put aside the fact that due to the US bureaucracy, they don't even have proper storage facilities for nuclear waste. So much of the US's nuclear waste simply just sits in warehouses. Now you could argue that with enough regulation and enforcement, nuclear is a very safe option, but the Fukushima incident in Japan would raise some questions. But what about countries like Somalia or the DRC? Is it at all possible, or even in the globe's interest, to see nuclear power move into countries like this with very relaxed regulations?
To be clear, I'm not advocating nuclear for Africa. And I don't advocate this course of action, but I can tell you that Russia in particular is strongly trying to promote floating nuclear as a potential solution for some of Africa's problems. I don't think it's plausible. Russia has had success using floating nuclear in some of its Arctic applications, but it continues to be a technology of significant concern. So no, I would not advocate nuclear as an early solution for Africa, but nuclear is going to be associated into the long-term future with grids that are relatively stable and reliable, with nations that demonstrate an ability to pay energy bills. So for nations where there's still basic energy governance remains unclear, I don't see nuclear playing a lead role in that.
The main reason nuclear is talked about so much is because of its ability to provide baseload power. And for those who are unaware, electricity demand in a major city across the day isn't constant. On a graph, it kind of goes up and down and up and down. You see, there's around 40% of the grid's capacity that is needed 24/7. This is known as your baseload power. It's the part of the grid that needs to be running no matter what. But in periods like between 4 to 7 p.m, when most people get home and turn on their air conditioners and their ovens and their kettles and their TVs, the power demand drastically spikes up, putting lots of strain on the grids. Nuclear and coals are great for baseload power, as they usually run very consistently, but it does take a long time to ramp up and shut down, which isn't the most efficient when you know everybody's coming home at 5 o'clock. So you either have to start ramping it around midday, or you're not ready for the afternoon demand. When it comes to gas or hydropower or even power stored within batteries, they're great for peak power, adding that 60% of the grid when it's required in those peak times. Because you can turn these on and off really quickly, some of these power stations will only end up running a few hours a day just to cover those peak demand points. So the baseload power runs all day, and the peak ones turn on when they need to. So why is it that countries in Europe are largely looking to build up their peak demand plants, whereas China is focusing on mostly building up its baseload plants?
China is choosing to go nuclear partly because they're still finishing out their baseload. China's still interested in building out that 40%. And nuclear actually is a useful component of that baseload. So for China, the other issue is they're experiencing significant economies of scale, and they are on a course to pursue nuclear energy in a lot of different places, and they see it as a baseload non-coal generating capability.
And to wrap it up here, I want to circle back to one of your earlier points. If you view the current war in Ukraine as the first war of energy transition, where do you think the next ones will be?
So I continue to worry, and it's an occupational hazard because it's the region I look at. I continue to worry about Russia. When we look at how Russia's thinking about the future, they're still planning so aggressively on an oil and gas dependent future. And there's no clear signal that major minds in the country are looking at other things. Anatoly Chubais, who has in the past year left Russia, was the most powerful advocate of renewable energy, and he really wasn't getting very much traction. So I worry about Russia. I also worry, frankly, quite a lot about Iran. Iran has had extraordinary problems managing energy demand in their own country. Demand has run ahead of supply over and over again in both electricity and in refined gasoline, and they keep trying to catch up. But every time Iran tries to raise the prices on something like gasoline, you get more riots and demonstrations. So providing energy to the people has become such a part of the social contract in Iran that they're going to face domestic instability associated with energy, even at the same time as they're going to continue to be challenged in terms of the markets that they can still access.
Imagine you come across two magic boxes. With the one on the left, every time you put $1 in, it spits out $1.25. And with the one on the right, every time you put $1 in, it spits out 5. Surely you'd empty your pockets right away and put every dollar you have into these boxes. And surely you'd keep using the box on the right. After all, its returns are much better. And herein lies the problem. With petrostates like Venezuela or Angola, their governments looked at that dollar and knew that by investing in the oil sector, it would net them 5 and create a lot of money which the regime could then pocket. Whereas putting that dollar into the textile industry or manufacturing or education would only pay out a slight return, particularly in the short term. So these petrostates just kept funneling more and more money into the oil sector at the expense of every other sector in the economy. And whilst the sun was shining, that may have been viable. But what happens when the price starts to drop and that box no longer works? You arrive at a situation where you have no more oil money coming in, and every other sector of your economy is in tatters. That situation is a fast approaching reality for states like Angola or Nigeria. What happens to these countries when the oil revenues stop, and how will this sudden shock to the system spill out into the regions around them? Well, to answer that, we turn to a third guest.
Part 3. Endgame Economics.
The world is definitely going to be using oil in 2030. It's just really a question of how much we're using and what we're using it for. Peak demand being around the corner is still a very real thing. Our house view is it'll probably happen around the end of this decade. But it's important to understand that even once we reach that peak, we'll probably still consume a relatively similar volume for the next few years before that decline really starts to kick in.
Colby Connelly is a senior research analyst at Energy Intelligence and a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Colby works primarily on regional macroeconomics, operating conditions, and political trends within the Middle East and North Africa, including the oil markets, OPEC+, geopolitics, and the regional effects of energy transition, whilst also contributing to competitive intelligence research by examining corporate strategies and developments within the region. And we're thrilled to have him back on the program today.
Most of the demand segments that account for major portions of oil use today are transportation fuels. So naturally, you'll think of gasoline, you'll think of diesel, but also jet fuel, other things like fuel oil that often get used in maritime shipping as well. Decarbonizing those sectors will do the most to reduce oil demand. You see things like greater usage of EVs, electrification of heavier transport, maybe use of other fuels like potentially hydrogen or things like LNG getting used to power shipping. That'll change that sort of demand segment, but even at this point, there's still an enormous range of consumer goods that rely on petrochemicals. So that's a segment that's actually likely to keep growing beyond peak oil. It's just not one that's going to be big enough to actually reverse the peak.
You would know better than most just how reliant these petrostates like Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or Nigeria are on their revenues from fossil fuels. So what happens when the demand for oil drops or they simply get priced out of the market? Is there any sort of plan B with these countries?
If you were to remove the oil industry from any of these economies tomorrow, it would be an unmitigated disaster. And talking in those terms isn't even that hyperbolic at this point, because this is almost exactly what happened in 2020. All you have to do is look at the pain that these countries went through when prices crashed at the beginning of the pandemic, because it was really the stress test of a lifetime. And COVID showed us that if it were to happen, very quickly, no one would really be ready for it. One of the things that I think you're going to start to see play out quicker than the industry just kind of drying up in these places particularly quickly is in relation to the exposure that different countries have to individual markets. And the example that I like to use for that is Oman. And I probably touched on this when we talked about Oman a little bit last year, but at the time of the pandemic, almost 80%, actually more than 80% of Omani oil exports were destined for China. When COVID-19 hit and set things into this downward spiral and Gulf oil producers were getting hammered, Oman was just getting absolutely slaughtered in oil markets at the time. And I just checked a dashboard I used to track crude exports before we started talking today. And as of this year, Oman is still averaging about 71% of its crude exports to China. And that's down 10% from 2020, with overall exports actually being higher. So they're clearly taking steps to reduce that exposure and search for other markets. But they're still very exposed to the Chinese market, which even up to now has its own sort of volatility with zero COVID lockdowns, that people stop driving cars, they stop flying. It takes huge chunks out of demand. And with oil trade being restructured in the way that it's taking place now, we're also seeing more competition in Asian markets, as traditional suppliers are now competing with these discounted Russian barrels that have been redirected east away from European markets. And that's something that's even caused headaches for a country like Iran, which could reliably export, even these sanctioned barrels to China for the longest period of time. They're now having to compete with discounted Russian barrels as well. So the exposure to specific markets, and whether that's just on an individual country level or a regional basis, is something that's really often influenced by factors that these countries don't totally control themselves. And that's something that might provide some early clues as to how this dynamic plays out as we approach peak demand. Overnight, a lot of the things that you saw happen in other countries where oil revenue dried up was a lot of economic stimulus measures, but also a lot of things that were done that have been, frankly, kind of unpopular to try and boost non-oil revenue. And one of the big ones that took place was in Saudi Arabia, which raised it tripled its VAT tax rate from 5% to 15%. With the VAT being tripled like that, too, the other important thing to think about is it had only been introduced at 5% a couple of years earlier. So the overarching point that I'm trying to make here is that it will force a lot of these countries, even the wealthier ones, if this is something that happens very, very rapidly, to implement a lot of fairly unpopular policy measures that are really politically difficult. And those are in wealthier countries. So even imagine what subsidy cuts, spending cuts, reducing public employment looks like in countries that aren't as wealthy or well developed.
So I'm going to throw a sentiment at you that I've heard a few times, which goes along the lines of, well, okay, we can't completely get off fossil fuels, but we can move toward natural gas as our transition fuel, as it burns much cleaner than oil or coal does, and it'll work in a lot of the power infrastructure currently present in the Western countries. If Europe was to call countries like Qatar tomorrow and ask that they send enough gas to help them transition to completely get off oil, is that actually achievable? Is there anywhere near enough infrastructure for gas to be able to replace oil?
No, I mean, it's not ready, and it's a different market. It's a different commodity. There's an advantage to these countries shifting focus to gas, but it's not quite as clear cut as just exporting more gas to Europe or Asia or something like that. The increased focus on developing gas resources is advantageous to countries that have significant gas reserves for two very critical reasons. One is that the carbon emissions from gas being burned or from the end uses are typically much lower than that of oil, as well as the fact that, and this is probably maybe the more important one, is that gas demand is generally expected to peak later than oil demand. So with an increased focus on gas, there's a degree of future proofing that sort of takes place there. The only huge gas exporter in the Gulf is Qatar. There really isn't anyone that competes with them in terms of LNG. The important thing to understand about Qatar is that its natural gas production completely dwarfs its oil production. Qatari oil production is less than 1 million barrels a day, and that sort of puts them in a better position for the peak oil era. Germany did just sign this 15-year supply agreement with Qatar. I mean, it's been a long time coming. I think everybody's been wondering why there hasn't been an agreement between the Qataris and the Germans sooner. And that was a longer duration than Germany said that they wanted to sign. I think they were looking for more in the range of 5 to 10-year term agreements. And I'm sure Doha would have loved a 20-year agreement, but I really think they got what they wanted out of this, especially if there are more in the pipeline. Just to touch on part of the reason why a country like Qatar wants longer term contracts like this is because they're dependent on LNG exports as a core stream of government revenue. So longer term agreements definitely help with long term fiscal planning. But there's also the fact that Qatar is one of the top 3 LNG exporters worldwide, in addition to the U.S. and Australia. So if we talk about the top 3 oil exporters, that's the U.S., Russia, and Saudi Arabia. Qatar kind of sits on the podium there with LNG. So a more obvious benefit to those longer agreements is that if you are a major producer and you're traveling the world securing these long-term supply agreements, what you're doing there is exerting a considerable degree of influence over long-term gas demand, given the size and scale of your production and the duration of those contracts. It's not a guarantee. There are policy and technology changes that no one will see coming that have the ability to influence these things. But it certainly allows them to throw a lot of their weight around in that sense. In the other Gulf states, there are a range of uses in mind for natural gas. But the caveat here that I don't think gets brought up enough is that the Gulf as a region also consumes massive amounts of natural gas, not only because of subsidized energy sales to its own citizens, subsidized utilities and things like that, but also through heavier industries that have really been able to grow through this advantage of cheap and abundant gas. To emphasize the scale of what I'm saying here, I was getting ready to speak to you and reading up on a couple different things. But if you put Iranian and Saudi natural gas consumption together on an annual basis for the last couple of years, just the two of them together actually consume more than China. So they're huge gas consumers, and that plays a role in how they want to both grow the oil sector of their economy, but the non-oil sector as well, since natural gas has the potential to be something that can fuel domestic growth while also having that lower carbon footprint. But in terms of where the excess gas that Europe now needs is going to come from, yeah, a lot of it will start to come from Qatar mid-decade. But these other countries that are investing in higher gas production in the region, they're actually ironically doing it somewhat more in aid of better economic diversification than they really are to just, add to the value of their hydrocarbon exports.
So we've talked before about the demise of oil and how it will impact different countries in different ways, as the price to produce a barrel of oil is very different from country to country. At the moment, with oil prices around the $80 a barrel mark, everybody's making money, no problems at all. But as demand inevitably shrinks, the oil price is certain to shrink with it. And if oil drops below a sustained $45 a barrel, we reach a point where some of these countries would be losing money on every single barrel of oil they produce. And so they exit the market. First to go will be your UKs and some of your African states, but as the price drops more and more countries will be forced out of the market. Even when we reach the $30 a barrel mark, fracking, one of the major backbones of the US economy, becomes untenable. And if we reach a floor price of, let's say, $15, the only countries that can still make a profit on oil are Kuwait, parts of Russia, and Saudi Arabia. In which case, will the US just accept the situation and become completely reliant on oil from nations that are, let's say, less than solid US compatriots? Or will this situation force Washington to massively subsidize its own oil industries, like it does now with coal, to keep them alive for the sake of energy security? Does the US become completely reliant on Russia and Saudi Arabia, or does it take huge fiscal losses just to keep its own oil industry up?
Yeah, so the balance that these producers are going to have to strike if the prices fall, and we're talking about who leaves first. And I mean, for one, you'll have OPEC taking action where it can to, support stability. Certainly, that is an issue that's existential for a lot of these producing countries. So, you can definitely expect them to keep throwing their weight around there. The advantage that the high capacity producers in the Gulf have that they're going to continue to leverage going forward is obviously that they're low cost production. They don't have very complex geology, so it doesn't cost an enormous amount per barrel to produce. However, as a lot of these markets get increasingly carbon conscious, it's not just going to be low cost, but also low carbon intensity production. And that low cost, low carbon nexus is, something that helps to define what we refer to as an advantage barrel. And that's something that you start to see really being a long-term advantage for producers in the Mideast. So when the cost falls and you start to see the higher cost producers getting out of the game, I mean, that's going to really impact some places that are off their feet right now, like Venezuela, for example. That's also Canada, with oil sands production there. But in terms of why you have a country like Saudi Arabia or the UAE expanding their production capacity by 1 million barrels a day at a time when I just said we may see oil demand peak within this decade. What that strategy is it's really a goal of becoming the last man standing. And that'll obviously have plenty of security implications, like you mentioned. Anytime this comes up, I'm reminded of a scene from a movie called Syriana that was made years ago. And I can imagine some people rolling their eyes as soon as I bring that movie up. But there's a pivotal scene in that movie when Matt Damon turns to this the character who's this emir of a fictional petrostate in the Gulf and gives a speech how, it's running out and this is a fight to the death and all that. And he's talking about oil. But at the time that movie was made, people were talking about peak oil supply. The way that dynamic has flipped is that isn't so much of a concern anymore. But what we are going to see is a fight to the death over market share. We don't talk as in depth about what that might look like as we probably should, especially nowadays, because there are a lot more short-term problems to solve. It's going to evolve in an interesting way, and we had started to see some of that even before this war started, and even before you had European countries making strong efforts to get away from Russian crude and Russian gas. And a prime example of that is Saudi Aramco, which is the Saudi Arabian state oil company. At the beginning of the year in January, buying a 30% stake in a company called PKN Orlen, which is one of the largest, if not the largest refiner in Poland. And so they're now going to be supplying 45% of that company's crude feedstock for its refineries. And that cuts Saudi Arabia into the Eastern European oil market in a way that they weren't before. There just wasn't much of a historic presence there. And in fact, we don't really think of Europe as a growth market for oil right now, but competition to replace Russian supply is very substantial. And so an example of a country that has more of a problem doing that is Iraq. The reason I mention it is because Iraqi crude is comparable in its composition to the Russian grade of crude called Urals, a lot of which went to Europe. So Iraq is kind of scrambling to try and boost its export capacity, which is in total disrepair. There was actually a major leak at one of their export terminals earlier this year in order to take advantage of that situation. And this type of competition is only going to intensify as we get closer to peak demand. But what it also does show us is that the wealthier countries that are investing much more continuously in their upstream production and export capacity, like Saudi Arabia, are much better positioned to respond to these shifts than a country like Iraq, where there's been years of conflict, there's been corruption. They've had an extraordinarily difficult time attracting new investors into their oil sector, and in fact they've had a difficult time getting a lot of their legacy investors to just invest more in the country. And as a result, that shows what some of the disparity between these producers is going to be like. It's not necessarily just the price levels falling to certain price bands, but it's also just how resilient and how nimble some of these countries can be in responding to shifts in the market that are really happening very quickly. The balance that these producers are going to have to keep if they are looking to expand their market share while pushing the higher cost producers out is that they need to keep them low enough to damage their competitors, but they also don't want to drive them so low that their own revenues go up in smoke. And that's a difficult balance to strike. I mean, it's a lot easier said than done, especially when you have an organization like OPEC Plus, where there are a host of different national interests at stake. And as time goes by, those interests are going to diverge increasingly for reasons, not unlike what I just pointed out with Saudi Arabia and Iraq. That's just one example. There are a lot of these divergences that are growing increasingly wide. Once you do see a sustained price decline as demand peaks or starts to plateau, then I think you will start to see a lot of relationships, not just between producers and consumers, but between producers themselves, shift from much more collaboration to competition. And the competition is already there. It's just to what degree I think we're going to see it intensify. Longer term, it's something that you will see die with a whimper more so than a bang.
A sustained $30 a barrel isn't even that far out, and a number of experts we spoke to during the research phase for this piece indicated that it could come around within the next 10 years, depending on the outcome of a few elections or events. But at $30 a barrel, we're talking about the elimination of major oil producers like Canada, Brazil, most of the US, Angola, Norway, and even the UK, all of which are no longer viable producers of oil. The pond is shrinking, but there's much less people in the pond. And with a country like Angola, that would mean 80% of their exports gone, with nothing left to replace it, as the government has just continuously doubled down and doubled down and doubled down on the oil industry. This amount of GDP disappearing in a short space in this many countries is almost certain to cause revolutions, riots, wars, and instabilities throughout these countries. And yet all of this could be only a decade away. In fact, we may even see the price get down toward that number, and then the Gulf states simply flood the market for a couple of years to artificially push that price even further down, strangle the most expensive end of the market to death, force them to leave, and once they have the oil demand to themselves, raise the price, knowing that it will take the other countries years to ramp up their production again. So what will the US do in a situation like this? Give massive budget-shattering subsidies to the oil industries, or sit back, rely on the free market, and watch these petrol-dependent states clinging to their oil industries suffocate one by one? What do you think the most likely policy of Washington will be? Does the US re-enter the Gulf in order to protect the few remaining viable sources of oil? Or does it leave the region to itself and hope that the relationship doesn't break down between itself and Riyadh?
I think you're going to see the push for developing more domestic supply, more resilience in general. I mean, I think that's something that's going to take place now across a range of industries as well. But when we're talking about U.S. security interests and preserving the secure flow of oil out of a place like the Mideast Gulf, there are people who would argue that we're starting to see the U.S. less interested in being the security guarantor for the region. That's a conversation that's gone on a lot in the last couple of years, revolves around something that, in Washington gets referred to as Carter Doctrine. I'm more agnostic on that argument than a lot of other people are, but that's probably less relevant than the fact that there are a lot of officials, including officials from the Gulf, some of whom I've heard speak here in town, who don't feel that the U.S. is committed to defending the region in the same way that it did, for example, during the first Gulf War. It keeps happening, and there really isn't a major world power that's either willing or able to provide that security umbrella in the Gulf, whether it's working the way it's supposed to or not. And as a result of that, you're going to see the U.S. playing some version of this role for the foreseeable future because, again, as you pointed out, when there are fewer major producing countries that are either as reliable or continue to produce the way they have in the future, the region is going to become much more critical, absent a major disruption in U.S. Gulf relations taking place. And for as many upsets as we've seen in the last few years, there doesn't really seem to have been anything that's been able to break that trend. Once peak demand hits and the Gulf producers get closer to the point where they are, quote unquote, the last men standing, I think that security relationship is going to enter a new phase. But that also depends on how our use of oil evolves alongside those events and where the primary destinations for Gulf oil end up being, because that'll be an influential factor too. So that the Gulf becoming more critical to a shrinking market, I think, is just one piece of the picture.
These petrostates are mostly ruled by a small group of very rich elites, who, whether they be in the Gulf or in African states like Equatorial Guinea, due to their national resource endowments, are able to pay out all sorts of benefits to their citizens. And in these countries, you often experience an unspoken contract between the people and those in power, where the people in power will pay for everything, but in exchange, the people forgo any presence within the political decision-making of the country, which in some of these cases has been an arrangement that's worked well for both of them. But what happens when these petrostates start to run out of money, and they can no longer afford to keep doling out the benefits that keep the citizens happy? Will the citizens be willing to lose their benefits whilst also still not getting any political representation? These societal contracts are going to be broken, and this sets the stage for a series of revolutions across many of these petrostates. But which ones? And how will the government, or the major powers reliant on their government, respond to these uprisings? Well, to answer that, we turn to our fourth guest.
Part 4. The Peril for Petrostates.
Globally, we obtain our largest amount of energy from oil, followed by coal and gas. Fossil fuels continue to dominate the primary energy mix. It's not as though you can just switch it on and switch it off. So we're talking about a phase out, and a phase out over decades, not over weeks and months. And I think that there are so many factors, economic, geopolitical, domestic political, that will inform and structure both the decisions, the pace in which that phase out will occur, not just in globally speaking, but with respect to each country. I think it's fanciful to imagine that oil won't be around a decade from now.
John Calabrese is a lecturer in US foreign policy at the American University in Washington, D.C. He also serves as a senior scholar at the Middle East Institute, where he directs MEI's project on the Middle East and Asia. In addition to this, he's also the author of China's Changing Relations Within the Middle East and Revolutionary Horizons, Iran's Foreign and Regional Policy. On top of that, he also co-directed the MEI FRS project for the European Commission on Transatlantic Cooperation on Protracted Displacement. And we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
To some extent, risk and volatility and market gyrations come with the territory. But I think for the last, let's say, decade, and maybe going forward, we see an unusual combination of geopolitical and economic factors. Lots of moving parts, many possibilities conspiring to produce unusual swings. And there are various reasons for this. So we can just sort of tick them off in no particular order. There are supply disruptions, everything from refinery outages to domestic political and economic problems, putting a crimp in supply moving from one country into the global market. Biggest unanticipated contributor to the volatility were the pandemic lockdowns, which, dramatically depressed demand and resulted in a price collapse. I think you could probably consider the pandemic-related lockdowns as being, the mother of all shocks to the market. I do believe that we are heading, and I certainly hope that we're heading toward a decarbonized future. But the momentum that had been generated both before the pandemic and since the pandemic ended toward that future has caused investors to reconsider long-term placement of their money in the building of new oil production infrastructure and things of that nature. So the weakening of capital commitments in the oil sector have contributed to sort of uncertainties as it relates to demand here in the United States, but not just in the United States. There's record high or close to record high inflation and fear of recession, and those types of consumer confidence and economic factors in affluent countries, which are huge oil consumers. I think that too contributes to the volatility.
So we're all talking about going green at the moment, but for countries whose main source of revenue is the sale of oil, any diversion away from it would mean reducing their economic output and hurting the overall economic strength of their citizens. So how do we convince these countries to begin a transition now rather than just waiting for the market to boot them out all of a sudden later?
These are not simple matters, and these are not short-term processes. Let's look at the Gulf, for example. Saudi Arabia, UAE, major producers that for over a decade have developed pretty sophisticated vision documents or strategies for diversifying their economies. Nonetheless, they've made what you could consider to be quote unquote rational choices. What is it that enables them to derive most of their revenue? It's the sale of oil, and they've got a lot of it. And they have made the decision to try to extract, to the extent possible, whatever revenue they can before those resources become essentially stranded assets.
Well, let's take an example that you know quite well, Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have been touting their Vision 2030 plan, which is a roadmap to diversifying and decarbonizing the Saudi economy. But under that plan, they were hoping for 10% of the Saudi economy to be coming from foreign direct investment, or FDI. This would be things like people building hotels in the country, or theme parks, or international companies moving part of their manufacturing process into Saudi Arabia. They have been throwing around buckets of money to achieve this goal in an attempt to entice foreign businesses to start up in Saudi Arabia. But rather than hitting the goal of FDI accounting for 10% of the Saudi economy by the start of 2030, they're currently sitting at just 0.57%, not even 1/10 the way there. And that's a huge shortfall. Is this a sign that even if Saudi Arabia, that with all this funding and a central strategy and the will to do so, that if they can't achieve this transition away from just being a petrostate, is there any hope for countries like Kuwait or Angola, who may not have the same money or will to do so? Is there any hope for these countries to transition away from oil before it's too late?
On the Saudi side, investor confidence is probably, in generic terms, the number one obstacle to their having achieved the goal of deriving a 10% FDI from external sources. And if you dig down a little bit into why that's the case, there I think are several factors. One is that it's taken quite a long time for the Saudis to address IPR, intellectual property rights. Number two, the legal frameworks have taken time to develop as well to provide the kind of confidence that investors want and need in terms of the security of their investments. Questions regarding, transparency in Saudi Arabia persist. Those are some of the factors.
Situations like this will be germinating instabilities throughout the region and increasing the likelihood of anything from another Arab Spring popping off in the region to oil markets experiencing large fluctuating swings in price, which causes problems throughout the subsequent economies. I mean, just look at the chaos in the markets caused by one ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal for 6 days. And then imagine if Egypt was to fall to a rebel group or experience large-scale terrorism. There are so many flashpoints throughout the Middle East which could have wide-ranging reverberations throughout the oil markets. So for countries like China, this must be incredibly worrying, as they get the vast majority of their oil from the Middle East. So going forward, do you think China is more likely to stick with the Middle East as their oil supplier, just rolling the dice each day, hoping there isn't a major upheaval anywhere in the region? Or are they more likely to move to more expensive, but also more secure sources of oil in countries like Malaysia, Kazakhstan, Indonesia, etc.? From your expertise, what will Beijing pick? The risky cheap oil or the secure expensive oil?
I think the answer to that question is pretty simple and probably applies not only to China, but to any country that is dependent on external sources of energy, which is an effort to try to strike the balance between energy security and cheap oil. The volatility that we discussed earlier has reinforced a sense of insecurity in China about its energy future. And we could already see evidence of what China is hoping to accomplish in the longer term in order to mitigate against some of these perhaps anticipated, but mostly unanticipated shocks to the system. And so you do see China having depended more at some political risk on supplies from Russia as a way of cushioning itself against the high oil prices. The problem, though, is that the Gulf remains critically important, and I don't really see that there's an easy exit from dependence on Gulf oil. China had been buying oil from the United States once the United States became, at least temporarily, the world's leading producer and exporter. And, everyone was predicting that for X amount of time, the United States had replaced Saudi Arabia as the swing producer, which of course hasn't quite panned out as many had predicted. But the relationship between China and the United States has deteriorated to the degree where China can no longer count on US supplies, in part because they're concerned about, with some justification, that the further deterioration of the geopolitical relationship might end up costing them in terms of a disruption of supply. So fortunately or unfortunately, for Asian customers who consume the lion's share and will of Gulf oil supplies, there's no easy exit.
When revenue drops in some of these Gulf states, the governments will have to make up the shortfall somehow, and many will likely look to actually taxing their populations, who at the moment are either not taxed or taxed very, very lightly, with usually just a 5 or 15% VAT, which complicates things, as up until recently there's been this agreement between the Gulf state monarchies and their populations. The people get everything subsidized, heaps of things are provided to them, and they don't have to pay taxes, but in exchange, they don't get political representation. Everything is ruled by the monarchy, which to be fair for the last few decades seems to have worked. But as those revenues continue to drop, the Saudi government will either have to start cutting programs or introducing higher and higher levels of taxation, and the population is likely to begin to demand political representation, which, as we discussed in our recent Saudi Arabia episode a few weeks ago, can very quickly wind up with extremist groups overthrowing the monarchy and coming into power in Riyadh. Extremist groups that would then hold on to the largest supply of oil in the world, then extremist groups that hold many grudges throughout the region and the international community. With that in mind, how are these Gulf states planning on getting around this problem? Are they going to introduce higher and higher taxes or cut programs, or will they just forfeit their power?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it opens up really, not Pandora's box, but it begs so many other questions about the political economy of Gulf states, or the political economy of petrostates generally beyond the Gulf. But the Gulf itself, the Arab states, are a very interesting sort of set of countries insofar as the social bargain is considered. How is it that the monarchies have derived their legitimacy and withstood the political upheavals, the turmoil, for example, that we saw region-wide in 2011, 2012, and that are still ongoing, whether you're talking about the horrific civil war in Yemen or the tragic situation in Syria. Well, they've done so by creating a system whereby the state doles out money to citizens in various forms. Citizens of the Gulf have become accustomed to finding jobs in what has become a bloated, in some ways dysfunctional bureaucracy. The private sector, the development of the private sector has been stunted by this overwhelming state-led, centralized economic structure that rests on this social bargain, whereby citizens remain loyal and support the monarchy, and the monarchy in turn supports livelihoods and reasonable living standards. The Saudi government is not the only government in the Gulf that recognizes that the pressures have been increasing for them to try to restructure or redefine the nature of the social bargain. But this requires like a multi-level and a multi-dimensional set of efforts. You could argue that the primary impulse that drove the crafting of the vision documents, which are documents that lay out economic diversification strategies, that the primary impulse for doing that wasn't necessarily acts of patriotism, but acts of regime survival. These regimes can only survive and thrive to the extent that they can address the demographic bulge and pressure of a young generation that's not only more aware of the world, but that is increasingly aware that they're ill-suited or ill-equipped to enter the 21st century global marketplace. And so all of those regimes are essentially trying to redefine what the social bargain is in order to maintain their positions in power. And that requires a multi-layered effort. So all of these things, paying taxes, the Saudis have begun to introduce taxes. VAT was introduced, I think, a year or two ago. This is all happening, but it's happening slowly. Pressures have been building. It's a race between the monarchies or petrostates' efforts to meet the demands of the future and the demands of their populations, and the political will and the means at their disposal to accomplish these aims.
Imagine an old Nigerian woman sitting at the back of a dilapidated, cramped bus in downtown Lagos. The bus ride she takes to work is 4 times as long as if she were to just travel by car. So she's been saving up for months to be able to afford a used Toyota for around $4,000. And after months of hard work, she's finally excited to be able to go buy the car and drive to work, gaining her 2 extra hours a day from her commute to be with her grandkids. But then a European man comes in and tells the woman, "Stop what you're doing. The car you're about to buy isn't energy efficient. You should buy an electric vehicle instead for around $40,000. That would be better for the environment." What do you think the old woman would do? And this is one of the other major problems here, as these solutions may be affordable to us here in the West, but for developing nations, these solutions are far outside their budgets. So we need to not only innovate great energy solutions for Western countries, but we also need to be able to provide cheap and efficient energy solutions to the developing world as well. As what's the point if half the planet's going green and driving around in EVs if the other half of the planet is driving the gas-guzzling cars we just threw away? The answer is in technology, but so is the bottleneck in achieving it. And to take us through what we're up against, we do to our final guest.
Part 5. A Terminal Twilight.
The winners are the countries that are finding a position for themselves or involved in the battery supply chain, because batteries are really going to be key to the energy transition. And I don't think we realize how important a technology they are. If we look at electrifying all the cars on the road, we're going to need a lot of batteries. And we also need batteries to store renewable energy, to integrate renewable energy with the grids. And these clean energy supply chains can offer a lot of economic potential and jobs to the countries who get involved in them. And the winners are really these countries and companies that are dominant in these sectors. So China is obviously a key winner, produces 80% of the world's lithium-ion batteries. it's quite dominant in a lot of different stages of the supply chain. But there are all these other countries, such as Chile, Indonesia, big nickel producer, Democratic Republic of Congo, big cobalt producer. These are all countries that are emerging to the forefront now as significant players in the energy transition, and in many respects, winners in this transition.
Henry Sanderson is the executive editor of Benchmark Mineral Intelligence and the former mining correspondent for the Financial Times. He was also previously a reporter for Bloomberg focusing on China and is widely known for his reporting on energy transition and the minerals used in clean energy. He also co-authored the academic book about China's state capitalism and its largest overseas lender, China's Superbank, and has recently released his long-awaited Volt Rush, the winners and losers in the race to go green. And we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting story because if you look at the financial crisis at that time, both the US and China wanted green jobs, wanted to shift to clean energy as a way to stimulate their economies. But China actually ended up in a much better position than the US. And if you think about countries like the UK now, where I am, like green jobs is still a big political talking point here, but we haven't quite got there yet. But China really focused, very hard on developing a lot of these industries. And it wasn't easy, in solar, there was obviously quite a few bankruptcies a few years ago, but they emerged now to really be dominant in solar cell production, in batteries, and also in rare earths and rare earth magnets, which are used in wind turbines and electric vehicles. My final point about why China is dominant is a lot of the industries in the clean energy supply chain are quite dirty and energy intensive. And if you look at things like processing critical minerals, it wasn't industries that the West wanted. It was very polluting. And China became dominant in that end of the supply chain because that was globalization, right? Shifting these dirty things to China, and also because of their labor costs were lower 10 years ago or so.
So the minerals required for energy transition, like lithium or cobalt, mostly come from less developed nations like Bolivia or the DRC. If these nations have the minerals that the rest of the world needs, do you see them capitalizing and growing rapidly like the Saudis did at the beginning of the widespread adoption of oil? Or do you see them just becoming resource traps like Angola or Ghana are today?
Countries such as Chile, they have big amounts of lithium. They also have great renewable energy potential. And if you combine that, there's lots of sort of investment that they can get, industry that they can get, hydrogen production. So when I talk about them being winners, is for those reasons, right? They're in a great position because lithium is probably not going away for anytime soon because of its use in lithium-ion batteries. If you look at countries like the DRC, it's a slightly more mixed picture in the sense that they're very dominant in cobalt, like the Saudi Arabia of cobalt, but they're sort of caught between China and the US, and Chinese companies are the ones sort of mining the cobalt and also buying cobalt off poor individual people who are digging for it. And you could say that the Congolese don't get a great deal out of that equation. So just to sort of frame it in geopolitics, all of these countries will benefit, but they're also caught between the US and China. For countries like Chile, they're very beholden to China because China buys all of their copper and all of their lithium. Countries like the DRC are sort of getting more caught now between these two great powers. So the US-China relationship is sort of like the main fault line that runs through a lot of these countries at the moment.
So it seems to be that most of the energy transition actually hinges upon batteries, as you'll need batteries to store your wind and your solar, you need them for electric cars, you need them for new technology, etc., etc., etc. But as it stands today, China really does control the vast majority of the battery industry, and battery companies that start up elsewhere often find themselves undercut by the Chinese and go out of business. Do you see batteries becoming the major bottleneck in our technology as we exponentially ramp up our reliance on green tech?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because if you think about the scale of battery we need, it looks like it's going to be difficult to achieve. But I think I'm getting more optimistic because, the US has launched this Inflation Reduction Act that really is a huge piece of industrial policy, and it's really stimulating a lot of new battery manufacturing in the US. And I think once you unleash the potential of the US, you give a clear policy signal. And let's hope it's not changed by elections, etc. Then I think we're going to see a lot of battery manufacturing constructed in the US. China is going to power ahead. If you think about all these developments, I think we probably will have enough batteries, but geopolitics is quite critical because if the US in particular wants to sort of remove China from the supply chain, that could create more difficulties and could delay the energy transition. So you're right, it's a concern from that point of view.
I'm as happy as the next person to see the US ramping up their battery building technology, But even the basics of economics tell us that even if the US get to large-scale production of batteries, they're going to be much more expensive than Chinese-made ones. So for the sake of the argument, if the US and the Chinese go to market, with the US battery being $200 and the Chinese battery being sold for $100, that leaves us with two options. Either one, the US government subsidizes the price of these batteries with taxpayer money. In other words, the US paying $100 of every battery, so that the consumers pay China-level prices for the batteries, and the US battery factories stay open, and we don't see an entire industry forced out of business by China, much like the rare earth industry. The other option, though, is the US does nothing, and the $100 batteries from China fly off the shelves, and the $200 batteries sit there, as the world continues to buy half-price batteries from China. And with no demand for the batteries, these battery companies eventually go out of business, meaning we put all this money into the industry for practically nothing. And even if Biden were to announce huge subsidies, paying half the price of batteries at a massive cost to the taxpayer, there is no guarantee that the next administration will continue that agreement, and at the stroke of a pen may remove the subsidies and make the entire US battery industry untenable. And with this sort of Damocles hanging over the industry, that means that private investors are likely to be very hesitant about putting long-term money into this industry, knowing that they can put years of investment into factories, and with the change of administration and the tearing up of these subsidies, a countdown clock to the death of the US battery industry immediately begins. So how does the US plan on getting around this, frankly, fundamental issue?
I think that is the issue. I think that's why the Inflation Reduction Act is so significant, because they're offering just such generous incentives. So I think they've thought carefully about how to compete. That's the answer, right? Which is you need to massively subsidize this industry so you can compete with China. And I guess what the hope is, and what we need to see in the US, is that we need to see the cost come down with experience and with production increases. And that's what we need to see. But for sure, the number one issue is competing with China is extremely difficult. Not only have they quite a big head start, but a lot of their economy can be very competitive because a lot of the supply chain is in China, right? So a lot of the sort of materials you need and the skills, the engineering skills, so they have a lot of advantages. So I do think the answer in the West is something like the Inflation Reduction Act, where you have to subsidize to kickstart this industry. I think for automakers, they are very cost conscious, and they're not going to necessarily, out of the goodness of their hearts, buy products that are not cost competitive. And we've seen that in Europe. We see Mercedes, Volkswagen, they're relying on Chinese battery manufacturers because they know that they need a cost effective product and they need it pretty soon to go electric.
What the surveys show us at the moment is that the majority of people living in major Western cities would be happy to change their car to an electric one. But as it currently stands, only around 1% of the United States actually drive an electric car. So what do you think would be required for governments to actually take electric cars mainstream?
So the cost needs to come down, so way too expensive, and they need to be completely cost competitive with petrol and gasoline cars. To the charging, I'm in the UK and I charge a lot, and it's just too variable. Some chargers are out of order, and there are also a whole load of different companies. So you have to download an app, you have to join up, to do all sorts of nonsense. The governments need to ensure that charging is 100% effective and it's simple for consumers. That's probably one of the most important things they can do, one of the easiest things they can do, right? So just remove any uncertainty. There needs to be not a shred of doubt about charging. And so governments need to really get going to promote charging.
And to put it in perspective, to move toward electric cars, we would need to do massive upgrades to our electric grid and build a lot more peak power for when everybody comes home from work and either charges their car on the way home or plugs it in when they get home. We would need to secure a battery industry that China currently dominates and is likely to undercut us on. And we would need to bring the price of EVs right down to an area where they become comparable with buying a Toyota Camry, so as not to price out the majority of the market. And on top of this, we would need to build up all of our charging infrastructure, either by massively scaling up the ones we have, so there's not huge waiting lines at fuel stations, and some cars can take up to 40 minutes to charge their batteries. But if we do allow people to charge their cars from home, much like they would an iPhone, it solves the waiting problem at the stations, but it will put huge stress upon our suburban power grids, and will require massive updates right now to be ready for the future. So with all this in mind, where do you see the next decade of policy going? How will governments be tackling these issues with EVs, let alone the wider energy needs?
I think this decade is going to be complicated, right? And I think we're seeing a lot of the tensions of the energy transition come out, and the geopolitics of it are going to be complicated and difficult. On the sort of climate change side, you've obviously got the tensions between developing and developed countries, and how can we finance and provide finance to developing countries? What's the best way to do that? But I do think this decade, minerals will be quite key. And I do think that the solution, or the issue to be resolved is China, right? And how relations with China are going to be not necessarily resolved, but how can we coexist, and how can we diversify away from China without a completely abrupt fragmentation into different supply chains? I don't think that's necessarily the best way. I think we've got to diversify, build up our own industries, but we need to have some sort of global market. That's really going to be key to clean energy, which is how do we solve some of those tensions? Yes, if I look out to 2030, we're going to see a world where some countries are really benefiting from the clean energy transition, from the jobs, manufacturing jobs, and I'd say US, will definitely be there, as will China. But we are going to see some losers, and I'd say that'd be the high cost oil producers, for example, and other countries that just don't have any presence in this supply chain. So countries like Australia could be key beneficiaries, right? They already are key beneficiaries. And we could see also the oil producing countries, especially Saudi, invest a lot in this sector, and also actually be quite big players in clean energy. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see.
Energy transition is the most important piece of the puzzle when it comes to fighting climate change. And even though to some people it is a cultural issue still, it hardly matters if Billy Bob in the swamps of Louisiana is driving his giant F-250 truck if his entire house, workplace and shops are all powered by renewable energy. But with every big step forward in technology, massive geopolitical shifts come with it. And much like the phasing down of coal over the last decade, oil is standing next in line. This process is certain to cause some discomforts, particularly for the states not preparing themselves for a change that is coming whether they want it or not. But as painful as that change might be, it's a change we desperately need to start in order to avert an even worse outcome. I know some of the people who have listened to this series may come away from it feeling disheartened, that the road to the green revolution is paved with landmines. But I stress to you, don't feel that way. The way I look at it, a doctor doesn't complain when he finds out you have stage 1 cancer. In fact, he's happy, as now he's identified the problem and he can prescribe a solution now, long before the cancer grows and spreads to other parts of the body. And that's the way you should be looking at this. This series should be looked at as an early diagnosis, a stern warning of what's to come if things don't change. And it's my absolute hope that things do. But it's also my hope that this series is something that we look back on in 20 years and thank our lucky stars we avoided. This was the 5th and final part of The Green Line, our mini-series focusing on the geopolitical implications of climate change. And this series has been some of the content I have been most proud to put together. I went into it having no idea how the audience would react to any of this, if people would come along for the ride or even listen, or even if the message would actually resonate with anyone. But seemingly, it has. All of the DMs and emails and comments you guys have sent to us about this series have been amazing. And I really cannot thank each and every one of you enough. It's taken so much work to put this series together, but to see that people are actually taking messages away from this really makes it worthwhile. So if you come along for all 8 hours of this topic, I really can't thank you enough. And if you liked this concept of us doing multi-part miniseries in addition to the show, please let us know, so we can get a gauge and decide whether to produce more of these miniseries on other topics that are far too big for a single episode. But as much as I want to thank you for listening, there is another group I can't thank enough as well. And that's our partners at the Mission Climate Project for all of their help on this one. We here at the show have always believed in doing lots of research, but we also believe in working with the experts who are 20 years ahead of me whilst I'm picking up the book for the first time. And that's why we teamed up with the team at TMP. And that's why we decided to collaborate on this one with a team over at TMP. Their organization has been working with us on this project since day one, helping us put together modeling, scratching data, finding sources, and extrapolating outcomes so we can build security models that gave us an insight to the next decade of reality. Whatever data we wanted, TMP got it for us. And we are forever thankful to the TMP team for all of their help on this project. And I very much hope it won't be the last time we do something together. But as much as TMP has been with us for the entire length of this series, if this is the first time you've checked out the series, or you want to find out more about what we do, you can find all our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeElliottOz. Oz is in Australia. And if you want to follow TMP over at Twitter, they're on the handle @Mission2020s. To maintain some consistencies and traditions with the main show, here are our 3 book recommendations for this topic. The first is Vault Rush by this week's guest, Henry Sanderson, for a look at how the energy transition will create a whole series of geopolitical winners and geopolitical losers. The second is Energy Transitions, Global and National Perspectives by Vaclav Smil, for a nation-state's perspective on the issue. And the third is The Squeeze, Oil, Money, and Greed in the 21st Century, for a look at some of the corruption plaguing this industry. I also want to thank this week's guests, Lou Munden, Theresa Sabonis-Helf, Colby Connelly, John Calabrese, and Henry Sanderson. I could not think of a better panel to help us culminate this series. In addition to that, a massive thanks has to go out to my staff who have done so much work on this project. Wade McCarr, the producer, as well as our former producer, who did a lot of work on this project during the early stages. Perry Grace, Daniel Isabella, Isaac Gibbs, Andrew Garbury and Robbie Sutton, our research assistants and writers, Francis Leach, our director of breaking news, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist and in-house climate change expert, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Jamie Tanu, our media director, Ross Crabtree, our media advisor, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. This team has been pulling double hours over the last few weeks, keeping the main show consistently coming out while also helping putting out the green line, so they have gone above and beyond for this project. In addition to my team, I'd also like to thank the team over at TMP. Lou Munden, Peter Riggs, Ben Bowie, Yumiko Jamobo, Willie Munden, Ivana Pavkova, and Lauren Bartholomew. As I said earlier on, these guys were instrumental in us being able to put this miniseries together, and it's been an absolute pleasure working with each and every one of them, and we look forward to hopefully doing it again sometime soon. This was the 5th and final episode of The Green Line, and we very much hope you enjoyed it. But not to worry, it's not the end of the show. The Red Line will be back and airing a normal episode in a week's time. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.